Hello to all of you. I'm Ian Bremmer here from New York City, and now we get to hear from you on some of views of where the scenarios for the world in 2030 that NATO has to adapt and align towards are heading. In a radically changing landscape, what I call a G0 world, we are seeing great divisions in the United States playing out with the election that we've just had. Less inclination for the United States to be the global policeman, the architect of global institutions, the cheerleader of global values, a divided post Brexit Europe, Russia in decline, but still very hostile to the interests, values, and standards of the United States and European allies, and blaming the West for much of their decline. China rising, but increasingly building its own competitive architecture to that of the West. How much the world is likely to change in the next 10 years, we're already seeing on the back of coronavirus, the largest crisis of our lifetimes, extraordinary acceleration in trends of global inequality, in a decoupling of the United States and China, particularly on the technology front, with difficulties for other countries to continue to hedge and balance between the two, and technology disruptions because the companies that are most innovative are the ones that, like we're using today, are most capable of getting us out of this crisis. With so many variables at play, we want to take the next 15 minutes to widen the lens a little bit and talk about what we need to do to prepare for the world of 2030. Three themes that we want to dig into and get your views on where we think the world is heading. First, one about the economy. Second, one about the global balance of power and its shifts. And third, one about the changing threat landscape. Taken together, these three themes will determine the most likely scenarios defining the world that NATO will operate in 10 years' time. So let's start with the economic forces shaping the future world. And the key uncertainty here is, will the global economy in 2030 be less globalized than it is today? Will it be more regionalized, increasingly automated, reducing incentives for global cooperation? Will it keep most countries looking more and more inward? So I want to prompt the first of three polls that we're going to use here for each of these sets of variables. And please use the live polling button on the left-hand side of your screen to submit your responses. It's available to registered participants on the left-hand side of your screen to submit your responses. It's available to registered participants on the left-hand side. First question in 2030, what best describes the global economy? Is it highly globalized as governments effectively tackle inequality and level the playing field? Is it governments viewing globalization through a strategic lens, with supply chains now reflecting national security concerns, are geopolitically motivated, more strategic, more vulnerable to weaponization? Fragmented globalization, data, trade, capital flows remaining vibrant, but mostly not at the global level? Or for economic nationalization prevails as governments respond to destabilizing inequality and throwing up more barriers? As you're voting, and we'll let you take some time, let me just mention a few variables to consider and some implications for NATO. First, big one, access to technology. The lines between economic winners and losers may well become starker and increasingly defined by access to and control of emerging technologies. Think about how we're moving towards more of a surveillance capitalism type world. And the fourth industrial revolution, more innovation, versus the post-industrial revolution, I'm left behind. At the same time, much more access to digital technology for everyone because there's so much more investment in innovation to get people access to smart agriculture, biotech, and smart education, distance learning. Inequality. Barring significant government interventions, inequality could easily get much worse in most NATO countries as labor force participation falls, and that could erode social contracts in the West. Finally, globalization and regionalization. The future of globalization could take multiple forms. One potential likely outcome is supply chains and trade agreements become primarily oriented around regional blocks, while on the tech side could truly bifurcate. the splinter net becoming the splinter net of things, anything with a chip in it. Okay, you've now had some time to vote, and overwhelmingly, you all think that we're going to see globalization through a more strategic lens, supply chains reflecting national security concerns. Now, if that's the case, then clearly NATO is going to become much more relevant as an economic institution, that the technology sector is going to become more strategic for all NATO allies and is going to align more with a nascent military, industrial, technological complex. Lockheed being in some ways the most strategic, too big to fail company back during the Cold War. How about if Amazon looks like that in 2030? That seems to be what you are implying from your response to this poll. Okay, let's switch to the second section, the global balance of power. We talk about this an awful lot. The key uncertainty here is, does NATO have less political, technological, and economic power in 2030 relative to China and other emerging rivals? Does it still have the edge in military and soft power? So here's your poll. Which of the following four best describes the global balance of power in 10 years' time? Is it first, a reinvigorated US-led liberal international order? I just saw the cover of Der Spiegel. Those guys are certainly saying that with President Biden coming on. Is it a multipolar global order underpinned by strong global institutions and diffuse power centers, more of a concert? Is it a new Cold War with competing spheres of influence around technology, economic, and security blocks? At last year's Munich Security Conference, there was a lot of talk about that. Or is it the emergence of a Chinese-led global order? Again, you're voting right now. As you continue to vote, take a look at those options. Couple things that are worth thinking about. First, maybe the world has exited a G0, an absence of global leadership by 2030, but there is clearly an enormous amount of uncertainty around what comes next. Could we conceive of G2 between the United States and China? Has the damage of the G0 world to global institutions and multilateralism been repaired? What kind of new architecture is emerging to deal with new challenges like climate, like cyber, like data and AI? And how does that affect the geopolitical order? And let's keep in mind that liberal democracy is not the unifying force it once was, either globally or even inside NATO, and leaving NATO countries more politically fractured because of the decline of public confidence in democratic governance. Not only that, but the gravitational pull of Chinese trade and investment. Finally, NATO is probably going to struggle to balance divergences between member states and security issues like the Eastern Mediterranean, where there's a lot of political disagreement within NATO itself, Turkey on the one hand, Greece and Cyprus on the other. That sort of thing could become a lot more frequent. Okay, let's look at what you say here. Closer than the first poll, but very few people think that China is about to become the leader of the global order. Even fewer of you think the United States could actually lead a reinvigorated liberal international order. Kind of extraordinary that you'd see only 3% of respondents on the back of Biden becoming president saying that could happen. G0 for longer. Most likely you see, my goodness, a new Cold War with competing spheres of influence around technology, economic, and security blocks. How much have we not learned from the course of the last generations? Important point here would be, how can NATO members be forced to balance their desire to benefit from China's growing economic heft against commitment to democratic values and the idea that a Cold War is coming? Another thing I would say is that the fact that global institutions are becoming weaker clearly makes NATO more relevant in this kind of an environment, gives it an opening to strengthen its influence if it grows more attuned to these threats and these changing geopolitical realities. Final thing is, if a coalition of democracies like the D10 emerges to fortify the post-world order against future challenges, NATO is clearly going to be looked at as source material for its design. Okay, the last section for you, and that is the future threat landscape. I already saw a similar poll that you did just before this session. The key uncertainty here is, to what extent is the immediate threat landscape in 2030 primarily defined by cyber warfare, tech-driven misinformation campaigns, and climate-induced disruptions. New threats. So here's your poll. What are the biggest risks for NATO in 2030? Same as ever. Russia, Russia, Russia. We keep talking about that an awful lot. Or is it new adversaries? China posing the primary threat to NATO in 2030. The real risks come from within. Only NATO can hurt NATO. We face an identity crisis because we're so different and the Americans don't want to lead as much. Or the most salient risks come from cyber attacks, misinformation campaigns, and climate-related disruptions. You're voting? And let me just say that cyber could well emerge as the main form of warfare by 2030, changes certainly how one would think about budgeting, about the orientation and spending on defense. Also, China may emerge as far more of a threat via cyber and other means than Russia. Tech capabilities are extraordinary. In fact, today, in many ways comparable with that of the United States. China has a much bigger data market. The Americans have more scientists, have better scientists for now. A lot of people believe that data drives better AI. Some don't. If it turns out that the data folks are right, NATO could be in trouble. What does that mean for power asymmetries as well between the United States, which has all the tech companies, and all the NATO allies? Finally, the greatest systemic challenges to individual safety, health, and prosperity could increasingly come from transnational, global challenges like climate rather than old threats like interstate war. Does that make NATO as a sub-global organization more challenging in being able to respond? Okay, let's see what you say here. Well, not a surprise that far more of you, 17%, think that China poses the primary threat than Russia does. So a very big shift for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But even more of you think that the real risks come from inside NATO, an identity crisis, so much growth in issues of division inside our own societies. If we don't fix those, so hard for the institutions to work. But the most important point here, over 50%, 56% saying the most important risks are the new risks. They're global risks, and many of them may not be coming from countries at all. They could be transnational, they could be non-state actors, and they could come from climate-related destructions. You know, a couple things I would say about this. NATO may well require, if this is right, a new organizing principle that encompasses all the threats facing the alliance in 2030. Give you an idea here. Is the opening Arctic theater a reminder of NATO's relevance, or instead the only issue of the future that NATO might be better suited than other institutions to address? In other words, is the Arctic NATO's fountain of youth, or is it the nursing home? Finally, NATO needs to decide which part is less relevant to the challenges of 2030. Is it the North Atlantic piece, or is it the treaty organization piece? I mean, the North Atlantic piece neglects that most growth, tension, and action are increasingly occurring in other places, as you've made clear in your responses, while the latter neglects that today's asymmetric challenges defy the logic of red lines that trigger collective defense obligations. Okay, final point. I want to give you a little prompt to do a world cloud exercise. Taking everything we've just talked about over the last 15 minutes and put it all together, write up to 10 words in the next 30 seconds, fast as you can, that you think best describe what the world will look like in 2030. Type them in, we'll get a world cloud going and we'll take a look at what you think. A couple other things I'd say. Does an effective NATO in 2030 need to go beyond governments and include a wider set of actors? I mean, it may take a diverse array of actors beyond states to meet the threat landscape of 2030. Antonio Guterres, my good friend, the Secretary General of the UN, has told me that his top priority is that treaties need to go beyond states. I mean, big multinational corporations in the West can increasingly have all the power over surveillance and data. Don't they need to play a role in an organization like NATO? How could you defend against cyber threats without them? What's the appropriate role for all of them? And finally, what unique contributions can NATO make to addressing transnational challenges such as pandemic disease, climate change, macroeconomic stability? What is NATO equipped to do that other organizations can't or less equipped to do, especially given the alignment that still exists in NATO and increasingly doesn't in lots of other parts of the world? Okay, so I'm looking at what you all have written, and there is a very tough agenda for NATO in place for the next 10 years. Look at this: fragmented, chaos, divided, uncertainty, polarized, grim. Frankly, multipolar is perhaps the only word that I see here that might be considered a more optimistic, more proactive agenda item for NATO. The rest are a threat environment that is indeed more challenging. What I can say is that that does tell you that the role of NATO is not going to diminish. It's going to be much more important, but also the critical nature of NATO reform is going to grow, and it's going to accelerate as we think through our G0 world and as we move into the world of 2030. I hope you found this useful, and really a pleasure as always working with NATO and working with the Munich Security Conference. I will be seeing you all certainly in Munich in February, and hopefully well before then. Be good.